Jake Turner never expected his life to take such a dramatic turn. A chance encounter with an injured woman in a restaurant would alter his fate forever. From the moment he helped Lila Harris after she injured her ankle, their bond grew amidst tragedy and love. But, as with any relationship, the road to happiness wasn't without its obstacles. The love they shared would be tested by a car accident, emotional neglect, and the shifting pressures of work and family. Will Jake and Lila find a way back to each other? Or will these trials break them apart? Jake Turner had always been the kind of person who preferred the quiet hum of technology to the noise of everyday life. At 35, he had carved out a successful career as a computer security expert, working tirelessly to protect others from the digital chaos that lurked behind every click. He wasn't one to enjoy the spotlight, content instead to remain behind the scenes, solving problems before they could even be noticed. When he wasn't immersed in code, Jake spent his time writing novels about the world he knew best: cybersecurity. The ideas flowed easily. But there was one problem: his personal life was a blank page. It wasn't that Jake was antisocial. He had friends and his family was supportive. But there was a gnawing emptiness that came with the routine. The endless hours at work, the quiet evenings spent alone, and the absence of something or someone to fill the void. The idea of love felt like a distant concept, something he had always put on the back burner while focusing on building a career. But deep down, Jake knew that something was missing. He longed for more than just professional success. He wanted connection, someone who could pull him out of his shell and make him feel alive again. That's when it happened, an ordinary night, or so it seemed. Jake, looking for a brief escape from his usual grind, walked into a local restaurant he frequented. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a quiet dinner to clear his head. But then something caught his eye: a woman in distress. He watched as she stumbled near the entrance, clutching her ankle. Instinctively, Jake rushed to her side, never imagining that this simple act of kindness would change the course of his life forever. Her name was Lila Harris, and that night, in the midst of her pain, Jake's life collided with hers. It wasn't just a chance encounter, it was the beginning of a journey neither of them could have anticipated. Jake knelt beside Lila as she winced, clearly in pain from her swollen ankle. He didn't know if it was the adrenaline or just a sense of responsibility, but he couldn't walk away without helping. He gently helped her sit down, speaking calmly as he assessed the situation. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice betraying his concern. Lila, though clearly in discomfort, managed a faint smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little embarrassed," she replied, her voice laced with a mix of humor and frustration. Despite her discomfort, Lila exuded a quiet strength, something that immediately drew Jake in. She wasn't the type to panic, even in a moment of vulnerability. As the paramedics arrived, Jake found himself not only offering his assistance but feeling a strange connection to her, something more than just a random act of kindness. She thanked him as she was taken to the ambulance, but as the door slammed shut, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had just met someone important. The next few days passed, but Jake couldn't stop thinking about Lila. Something about her had stirred something within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wondered if she was thinking about him too, or if she had already forgotten about the stranger who had helped her that night. He tried to push the thoughts aside, but they lingered, constantly nudging him. And then, one evening, he received a message. It was from Lila, a simple thank you for helping her at the restaurant. Jake's heart skipped a beat. That small gesture was all it took. They started chatting, and their conversations flowed effortlessly. It felt as though they had known each other for years. There was something about her openness, her vulnerability, that made Jake feel comfortable. He couldn't help but be drawn to her. What had started as a chance encounter had quickly evolved into something far deeper than either of them could have imagined. Their connection was undeniable, and for the first time in a long while, Jake wondered if this might be the start of something truly special. As the weeks passed, Jake and Lila's connection only deepened. Their conversations, which had begun casually through text messages, quickly moved to phone calls that stretched late into the night. Jake found himself sharing parts of his life that he rarely discussed with anyone: the insecurities he had about his career, the quiet loneliness that came with his success, and his hesitations about love. Lila, too, opened up about her past, the struggles she faced as a young woman in a competitive corporate world, her complicated family relationships, and her own doubts about her place in the world. It was an exchange of vulnerability that neither had experienced in years, if ever. The more they talked, the more they realized how much they had in common, how their lives, though very different, seemed to intertwine in unexpected ways. And then, it happened. Jake knew he had to see her in person again. He asked Lila out on their first official date at dinner at the same restaurant where they had met. It felt like fate, the way everything had come together. Jake, who had never been one for grand gestures, chose this place because it had become their unspoken meeting point, the place where their story had begun. It was there, over a quiet meal, that they both let their guards down. As they shared stories, laughed over shared jokes, and sipped wine under the soft glow of the restaurant's lighting, there was a moment, a single, perfect moment when their eyes met, and the world seemed to fall away. The spark between them was undeniable. Without saying a word, they both knew what the other was feeling. In that moment, Jake felt something shift within him. It was more than just attraction, it was a sense of comfort, of peace, of home. He reached across the table and took her hand. Lila smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "I think I'm falling for you," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila's response was equally quiet but filled with emotion. "I think I'm falling for you too." And just like that, their romance began, born out of a chance encounter and nurtured in the quiet spaces between their shared stories and dreams. Neither of them could have predicted how deeply their lives would intertwine, but they both knew that this was only the beginning. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jake felt ready to face whatever came next together with Lila. As their relationship grew, so did the complexities that came with it. What had started as a simple connection between two strangers now carried the weight of family dynamics, expectations, and personal histories. Jake had always been a solitary person, keeping his circle small, but Lila was different. She had a close-knit family that played a significant role in her life. This included her father, a proud and assertive man who, from the moment he met Jake, made it clear that he wasn't entirely sold on the relationship. The first time Jake met Lila's father, it wasn't exactly a warm welcome. Despite Jake's attempts at being friendly and open, her father, Richard, scrutinized him carefully, as though searching for any weakness he could exploit. Jake was used to navigating tense situations after all. His job as a computer security expert often involved walking into high-stakes environments where trust had to be earned. But this was different. This wasn't about professional respect, this was about Lila's future. Richard, with his booming voice and sharp gaze, didn't seem to approve of Jake's quiet, somewhat introverted nature. He was accustomed to seeing his daughter with someone more outwardly assertive, someone who had big ambitions and the kind of presence that commanded attention. Jake, in contrast, was reserved and humble, content to stay in the background. That didn't sit well with Richard, who was quick to voice his concerns. "You're a good guy, Jake, but I just don't know if you're what Lila needs," Richard had said, his voice thick with skepticism. "She needs someone who can take charge, someone who isn't afraid of a challenge." Jake, feeling the weight of the criticism, tried to stay composed. But it stung. This was the first time he had encountered such direct opposition to his relationship with Lila, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. Lila, seeing the tension, quickly stepped in to defend Jake, but the damage had been done. Richard's disapproval loomed over their relationship like a dark cloud, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it caused a rift. What was worse, Lila's family wasn't the only challenge. Her father's comments made her question their relationship and whether Jake was the right fit for her long term. As her doubts grew, so did the tension between them. "I don't want to be the reason you're at odds with your family," Jake had said one night, his voice filled with frustration. "But I can't change who I am, Lila." And so, their relationship, which had once felt so effortless, now seemed burdened with external pressure. It was clear that their love was about to face its first real test. The world as Jake knew it shattered in an instant, a cruel reminder that life could change in the blink of an eye. It happened on a rainy Thursday night, a routine drive home after another long day at work. The roads were slick, and the headlights of other vehicles blurred in the rain-soaked night. Jake had just finished reviewing a critical security report for one of his clients and was looking forward to getting home and unwinding. But fate had other plans. The car skidded on a particularly slick patch of road. Jake tried to correct the slide, but the vehicle slammed into a guardrail, spinning out of control before crashing into a concrete barrier. The impact was bone-jarring and everything went black. When Jake regained consciousness, the pain was excruciating. His body felt foreign, unrecognizable, too heavy, too broken. The reality hit him like a punch to the gut. He was in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped rhythmically, monitors flashing as nurses bustled around. His body was a patchwork of injuries: fractured ribs, a broken leg, a torn shoulder, and internal injuries that kept him tethered to life support. But it was the brain trauma that was the most concerning. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about potential cognitive damage, the possibility that Jake might never regain full use of his faculties. He wasn't sure if he'd be able to walk again, let alone return to his job or the life he once had. As the weeks passed, Jake was forced to confront his own mortality, and it shook him to the core. For someone so used to controlling his environment, this loss of autonomy was overwhelming. The reality of being utterly dependent on others gnawed at him daily. Lila, however, never left his side. Through every painful hour of rehab, every frustration, every moment of doubt, she was there. She held his hand, encouraged him, and never once showed signs of backing away, even when some of their friends and family hinted that perhaps Jake should start thinking about moving on and finding someone else. But Jake wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. He was so broken, inside and out, that he couldn't even trust himself to make a decision about their future. How could he expect Lila to remain by his side when he couldn't even figure out how to heal his own body? Despite his overwhelming gratitude for her support, part of him feared he was holding her back from a life she deserved, one without the burden of his shattered body. The strain of the accident, the constant pressure to heal, and the fear of being abandoned began to erode Jake's sense of self-worth. He knew that Lila was everything to him, but would she still want to be with him when he was nothing like the man she had fallen in love with? Lila Harris was no stranger to hard work and sacrifice. She had grown up in a family where every achievement was earned, not given. But nothing could have prepared her for the challenge of supporting Jake through his rehabilitation. She had always been strong, independent. But this was different. She wasn't just taking care of a partner recovering from an injury. She was helping a man rebuild his entire life piece by painful piece. At first, Lila was determined to do everything in her power to help Jake heal. She was by his side at every doctor's appointment, holding his hand as he endured painful therapies and spent hours in rehab. She would sit with him through every exhausting therapy session, offering encouragement, pushing him to keep fighting when it felt like he couldn't go on. Lila believed in him, in the man he was before the accident. She believed they could make it through this together. But as the months dragged on, something began to change. Lila found herself emotionally drained, physically exhausted, and more than a little resentful. It wasn't that she didn't love Jake, she did, deeply. But the toll of caring for him, coupled with the weight of her own personal and professional struggles, was starting to wear her down. She was missing out on her own life. Her career was faltering due to time away from the office, and her friends had stopped calling because they knew she'd cancel on plans at the last minute. The constant focus on Jake's recovery, on his needs, had consumed her life. And though Jake was endlessly grateful for her care, he seemed so distant at times, like he was lost in his own world, unable to see what it was doing to her. One night, after a particularly grueling day where Jake seemed to shut down emotionally, Lila snapped. She had been patient, understanding, and endlessly supportive, but her own needs, her own dreams, were starting to feel suffocated. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered one evening, her voice shaking as she looked at him lying in the hospital bed, the sterile white sheets reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above them. "I can't keep losing myself in this. In you. I'm drowning, Jake." The words stung like a slap, and Jake froze, horrified. He hadn't realized how much of a toll the situation had taken on her, how isolated and forgotten she must have felt. His guilt weighed heavy on his chest, but at that moment he couldn't figure out how to fix it. He was so wrapped up in his own pain, his own recovery, that he had failed to see the cracks forming in their relationship. Lila didn't say much after that. She just walked out of the room, leaving Jake to grapple with the reality of what his dependence on her had caused. It wasn't just about the physical pain anymore, it was about the emotional toll it had taken on both of them. And Jake knew, deep down, that if he didn't find a way to heal both himself and their relationship, he could lose the woman he loved. Lila's life was evolving in ways she hadn't expected. While Jake was focused on his long, grueling recovery, Lila had been working tirelessly to maintain some semblance of normalcy. As the months passed, her own career started to take on new dimensions. She had been promoted at work, and her role had shifted from a position of support to one of leadership. The job she had once found comforting had become both exhilarating and overwhelming. Her new boss, a highly ambitious and driven woman named Claire, quickly began pushing her to take on more high-stakes projects. Lila, eager to prove herself, began pouring more of her time and energy into her work, even at the expense of her personal life. What had been a source of pride, her role in supporting Jake during his recovery, was slowly being overshadowed by the growing demands of her career. The change didn't go unnoticed by Jake. He had become increasingly aware of the distance between them, not just physically but emotionally. There were days when Lila seemed distracted, absent even when she was right next to him. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was just that the weight of her new responsibilities was consuming her. She became more focused on climbing the corporate ladder, and her presence at Jake's side began to feel like an afterthought. Jake, already vulnerable from his own physical challenges, started to feel more abandoned than ever. He had seen how Lila had supported him tirelessly, but now the roles had shifted. Instead of feeling like a partner, he felt like an obstacle, something she had to deal with in between her professional achievements. The late-night work calls, the constant trips for client meetings, and the weekend overtime had left him alone for longer stretches, and the isolation was taking its toll. He tried to talk to her about it, but Lila always seemed too exhausted, too caught up in her own world to listen. "I'm just trying to build something for us," she would say, her eyes filled with determination. "Once I get through this, everything will be better." But Jake wasn't sure how long he could wait for that better future. His injuries hadn't gone away, his loneliness hadn't disappeared. Lila's absence, both physical and emotional, was becoming unbearable. And the more he tried to make her understand, the more he felt like he was fighting a losing battle. As Lila rose to the challenge at work, Jake began to question the future of their relationship. Could they find a way to balance their growing personal and professional demands, or was this the beginning of the end? Tensions had been building for weeks. What started as subtle signs of emotional neglect, Lila's long hours, her distracted demeanor, had now boiled over into something more palpable, more painful. Jake could no longer ignore the ache in his chest, the gnawing sense that Lila had emotionally checked out. It came to a head one late evening when Lila came home from yet another work trip. She was exhausted, her eyes red from the strain of back-to-back meetings and endless deadlines. Jake had been waiting for her, sitting in their living room, his leg propped up on the couch, staring at the TV without really seeing it. The silence between them had become heavy, suffocating. Lila walked in, barely acknowledging his presence as she dropped her briefcase by the door and made her way to the kitchen. Jake watched her, a quiet storm brewing inside him. It wasn't that he didn't understand her drive to succeed, it was that he had begun to feel like an afterthought in her life. "Lila," he called out, his voice more steady than he felt. "We need to talk." She turned toward him, looking exhausted but irritated. "Jake, not now. I've had a long day. Can we just not do this tonight?" But Jake couldn't let it go any longer. He had been patient, waiting for her to notice the growing distance, the subtle cracks in their relationship, but it seemed like she was too lost in her world to even see him. "No, we need to talk now," he insisted, his voice harder this time, You've been gone for days, and when you're here, you're not really here. I'm trying, Lila. I've been trying so hard, but I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this on my own." Lila looked at him, frustration flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" "I'm working so we can have a better future. I'm doing this for us, Jake." Jake's heart sank. "It doesn't feel like you're doing it for us. It feels like you've forgotten about us. I'm still here, Lila, struggling every day, and you're just gone." The words stung, but they were the truth. Jake wasn't asking for her to drop everything for him, he was asking for balance, for her to remember that they were supposed to be a team. But instead, it felt like she was too focused on her success to see the man she had promised to love, to be there for. "I'm not asking you to change everything," Jake continued, his voice cracking. "But I can't keep doing this on my own. I need you. We need to be a team again." Lila stood there, silent, the weight of his words sinking in. She had never meant to make him feel this way, but her career had consumed her, and she hadn't realized how much it had taken her away from him. For the first time in months, she looked at him not just as her partner, but as the man she had once fallen in love with. But now, Jake wasn't sure if they could fix what had been broken. He had already started to consider the unthinkable. Maybe it was time to walk away, to let go before they both became strangers to each other. The thought of leaving was terrifying, but the thought of living in a relationship where he felt invisible was even more so. After the confrontation with Lila, Jake spent the following days in a whirlwind of emotions. The weight of the argument between them, the raw honesty, and the hurt it had caused lingered in his mind like a constant shadow. He had spent so long waiting for things to improve, clinging to the hope that Lila would come back to him emotionally, but now he was faced with the uncomfortable reality that things might never go back to what they once were. There were moments when Jake considered leaving. The thought crossed his mind more frequently than he cared to admit. It wasn't that he didn't love Lila anymore, it was that he had started to feel like a ghost in his own relationship. Every day that passed, he became more convinced that maybe he needed to leave to find peace. But what did that peace look like? Was it really just being alone, or was it about regaining a sense of self-worth that had been stripped away in their slow drift? Lila had always been the center of his world, but lately it felt like she had abandoned him in every way that mattered. The hurt from her emotional neglect didn't disappear after their argument. It festered and grew, turning into a gnawing emptiness. Every time he looked at her, he saw a woman who had become a stranger. A woman who had drifted so far away that she might as well have been living in a different world. In the quiet moments when he lay awake in bed at night, the thought of leaving grew louder. He had sacrificed so much for her over the years, constantly putting his own dreams and desires on hold to support hers. He thought of the days when they were inseparable, when they shared laughter and dreams about their future. Could he ever return to that? Or was it time to acknowledge that maybe they had outgrown each other? Jake's friends had all told him the same thing: he needed to do what was best for him. "Don't stay in something that's hurting you," they'd said, urging him to find happiness elsewhere. But the thought of leaving Lila, of walking away from the life they had built, felt like an unbearable choice. His heart was torn between the hope that they could fix their broken marriage and the realization that perhaps it was too late for that. He spent days weighing his options, replaying the conversation they'd had over and over in his head. Would he be stronger by staying and fighting for their relationship, or was leaving the only way to protect himself? The longer he waited, the more the tension between them grew. His indecision was pushing him further into a corner, and with every passing day, the choice seemed to matter even more. The tipping point came one evening when Jake found himself sitting alone at a coffee shop, staring out the window at the busy street. He had spent the entire day replaying his conversation with Lila, and the pain of it still lingered. But this time, something was different. He was no longer consumed by the hurt, he was simply tired. Tired of the emotional roller coaster, tired of questioning every decision he made, tired of wondering if it was all worth it. For the first time in months, Jake felt a sense of clarity. The turmoil he had been living in wasn't just about Lila's absence, it was about his own inability to make a decision that would free him from the constant emotional chaos. He couldn't keep living in a state of limbo, torn between staying for the faint hope of rekindling what they had or leaving to find peace and solitude. The truth was, he hadn't just been emotionally neglected, he had been emotionally stagnant. And the longer he stayed, the more he was losing himself in the process. Jake knew he had to make a choice. The fear of losing Lila was real, but the fear of losing himself was more terrifying. He had been putting his life on hold for too long, waiting for someone else to make things right. But now he realized that it was up to him to make the change, to take control of his own destiny. Whether that meant leaving or staying, he had to choose. It wasn't an easy decision. The memories of their early days together, when they laughed over silly inside jokes, when they made promises to each other, came flooding back. There was so much love in those memories, so much hope for a future. But Jake knew that clinging to those memories without acknowledging the present would only keep him stuck in a cycle of longing and disappointment. As he sat there, a sudden wave of resolution washed over him. He couldn't keep sacrificing his own happiness for the sake of a relationship that was no longer nurturing him. If he was going to move forward, it had to be on his terms. He stood up, took a deep breath, and made the call. He would talk to Lila, not with the hope of fixing everything, but with the intention of finally giving himself the closure he needed. It was time to stop living in the past and start living for himself. Later that evening, he walked back home, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The road ahead would be challenging, but Jake had finally made a decision. Whether it was the end of his marriage or a new chapter, it was a step toward reclaiming the life he deserved. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more gripping stories. See you in the next video.